One of the defining features of the war in Ukraine has long been the phenomenon of mutual air denial. Russia has found some ways to leverage its much larger, more advanced air force as the war has gone on, with things like standoff attacks using glide bombs against targets relatively close to the front line. But for the most part, this has been a war where both air forces stick to their side of the proverbial line. And while both sides have received some replacements for their high-end anti-aircraft capabilities, like long-range air defence missiles or fighter aircraft, the pressure of constant attrition and the sheer volume of air defence demand has also forced a degree of creativity. We've seen a wide variety of methods, from the new to the very, very old, deployed to counter the constant threat of reconnaissance drones. Meanwhile, the drones themselves have been tasked to fill all sorts of roles in the air defence battle. We've seen drones against helicopters, drones against air bases, drones against air defence systems, and of course, everyone's droneception favourite, drones against drones, as Ukraine has turned to FPVs to knock down Russian reconnaissance assets. Roughly 2.5 years into this invasion, I think there's a range of observations we can make about how the Russians and Ukrainians are approaching the air defence problem, their losses, the sustainability of those approaches, and what they might potentially teach other forces around the world. And so today, we're going to talk about it. To do that, I'm going to start by giving a quick overview of the potential status of Russian and Ukrainian air defence forces. Then I'll look at some of the available evidence, including, excitingly, a lot of official Russian MOD data, to give us some clues as to how differently the two sides might be using their available air defence assets. There's an old saying that when all you have is a hammer, every problem looks like a nail, and Russia has a very large air defence hammer. Then we'll pivot into some tentative observations and points for consideration for foreign forces, as we try and unpack the question of what, if anything, the air defence story in Ukraine might be able to tell us about future peer-on-peer conflict. As a quick caveat up front, there's a couple of points that I'll only be able to speed past in this episode, and we'll cover in more detail in the future. The recent Ukrainian cross-border road trip will have to wait for next week, and a detailed study of estimated production and resupply quantities probably belongs in a dedicated episode. And as always, I'm probably going to be focusing more on things like broad trends, systems and defence economics considerations, not so much things like organisation or day-to-day developments. But with that said, let's jump into the role these systems have played in the war so far. The key starting point here is that by global standards, both Russia and Ukraine were very, very well equipped in terms of air defences in February 2022. And even if the quality levels were inconsistent, the quantities were very much there. Basically, as the Cold War went on, the Soviet Union first produced the largest arsenal of air defence missiles and launchers in human history, and then kept building. Russia inherited the largest chunk of that inventory and a lot of the relevant industrial base. But Ukraine didn't exactly miss out in the divorce settlement, and so started in February 2022 with an inventory of literally hundreds of air defence missile launchers, radars and supporting systems. And the resulting dynamic has arguably had a major impact on the way the war has played out. In previous American-led large-scale combat operations like 1991 or 2003, the first step we've seen Allied forces take has often been the destruction of the enemy air defence system. Air superiority, or preferably air supremacy, is secured first, and then the ground forces go about their critical work. In Ukraine, Russia was either unable or chose not to take that kind of approach. While there were serious attacks against things like Ukrainian SAM sites, the Russian ground forces did go in before the Ukrainian air defence system had been broken down. And that more or less remains the reality almost 2.5 years on. That's not to say that both sides haven't actively tried to break down the other's air defence system. We saw a lot of evidence of attempted Russian strikes against Ukrainian air defence systems as early as February and March of 2022. The image you see on the right there of destroyed Ukrainian S-300s isn't atypical of what we saw in the earlier stages of the war. And the Ukrainians, for their part, have repeatedly targeted Russian air defence systems in turn. Almost a framing question for this episode, then, is probably what sort of air defence assets have both sides lost? And following on from that, on a spectrum from capable to collapsed, what's the status of the remaining forces? What you can see on screen there is a chart showing the visually confirmed losses for surface-to-air missile launchers and self-propelled anti-aircraft guns for Russia and Ukraine at time of recording. What probably instantly stands out is that the relative ratio of losses between Russia and Ukraine is much closer with these systems than it is in many other equipment categories. With things like tanks or infantry fighting vehicles, we're used to talking about ratios of 3-to-1 or 4-to-1 in Ukraine's favour. But with surface-to-air missiles, the observed ratio so far is closer to 1.7-to-1. And in proportional terms, the longer-range systems, the S-300s, the S-400s, make up a much greater share of the Ukrainian losses than they do the Russians. Ukraine is visually confirmed to have lost more than 70 S-300 TELs, transporter erector launchers, since February 2022. The Russian losses, by contrast, are much more heavily weighted towards some still very expensive but shorter-range systems, things like Buk, Tor and Pantsir. There's probably no single explanation for those loss patterns, although a couple of factors probably go into it. 1. Russia appears to have prioritised the destruction of Ukraine's S-300s and similar long-range air defence systems. 2. Ukraine just started the war with a lot of them in inventory compared to other systems. And thirdly, most of the main Russian methods for targeting these systems, which involves pairing a reconnaissance drone with a long-range precision-guided weapon, probably makes it more likely, all else being equal, that you have visual evidence of a loss when a loss occurs. The reality is, though, as we'll keep coming back to, that there are just so many launches available on both sides of the line here that even these sort of quite heavy losses on paper probably don't represent decisive effects in and of themselves. Going by military balance estimates, 70 S-300 launches would be somewhere between a quarter and a third of the pre-invasion Ukrainian inventory, meaning that, at least on paper, Ukraine has lost a greater share of its Bradley infantry fighting vehicles than it has its S-300s. But the sky is a pretty big place, and without good sensors to tell your missiles where the target is or isn't, good luck with any attempt at long-range engagements. As early as 2022, there was a RUSI report calling out the value of certain specific sensor systems. Quote, Russian GBAT has been highly effective since March, especially the long-range S-400 SAM system supported by the 48YA6 Podlet-K all-altitude long-range surveillance radar system. End quote. And on the flip side, some Russian sources have had some pretty bitter things to say about the radars supporting Ukraine's Patriot batteries. Battery radars tend to be available in smaller numbers and more difficult to replace, especially on short notice, than launchers and missiles. And so, unsurprisingly, we have time and time again seen radar systems attacked by both sides, with the larger and more powerful systems often suffering particularly badly. If nothing else, it's probably fairly difficult to conceal a multi-story tall metal object that's beaming out the electromagnetic equivalent of a spotlight. For Ukraine in particular, getting replacement air defence systems from its various allies has been an absolute top priority. That's been driven by the intense importance and demand for air defence systems, damage to their existing air defence infrastructure, and also depletion of existing missile inventories. In February 2022, Ukraine started out with literally thousands of missiles for its S-300 and Buk systems. But at the same time, Russia also gave those systems a lot of things to shoot at. For all their military resources, one thing Ukraine's allies don't have is an infinite supply of Soviet-era SAMs. And so we've watched as Ukraine's air defence forces, like many other parts of the Ukrainian military, have had to speed-run a transition over to NATO equipment. For our purposes today, we're mostly concerned with three key implications of that process. Firstly, that over time, Ukraine might be gaining access to some capabilities it didn't have before. Patriot and SAM-T, for example, are going to do much better against hypersonics and ballistic missiles than the old S-300s. Secondly, you can't assume that just because Ukraine has a lot of its Soviet systems still intact, that it has enough missiles to fire from them. Now yes, even in a supply-constrained environment, having a bunch of S-300 and Buk missile batteries is likely to be useful for the Ukrainians. The radars presumably still work, the systems have a lot of range, and Russia's probably never going to be sure which Ukrainian batteries have been supplied with how many missiles. But we can't really just add what's been delivered and subtract what's been lost to work out the remaining strength of the force. As far back as December 2022, I released a video pointing out the supply constraints Ukraine was going to face when it came to interceptor missiles. And in 2024, I think the signs of serious supply constraints are very much there, even if new deliveries and developments like the so-called Franken-SAMs have generally kept the system active. Finally, and sometimes painfully for the Ukrainians, it means much of their ability to defend their airspace over time is driven by foreign commitments and foreign deliveries. You could say deliveries have occasionally been slightly delayed, if by occasionally you mean regularly, and by slightly you sometimes mean literal years. Back in January 2023, for example, it was reported that Canada had put up more than 400 million Canadian dollars to get Ukraine a NASAMS battery through a US effort. And for one reason or another, more than a year later, in March 2024, it was reported there was still no firm delivery date on when Ukraine would get these systems. The story of Ukraine's search for self-propelled anti-aircraft guns has often mirrored the hunt for missile systems. There have been some significant donors and deliveries have been made. But while the packages have included both quality and quantity, rarely have those two things overlapped. The single most common system reportedly supplied so far, for example, is apparently the Victor self-propelled anti-aircraft gun, which is essentially a glorified technical. 2 heavy machine guns mounted on a truck chassis with some decent sights. More than 80 examples of the German Flakpanzer Gepard have been made available and proven themselves very useful against a wide variety of targets. But a supply of just over 80 probably misses the numbers Ukraine wishes it had by a factor of 10. If you want an extreme example of this disparity, Ukraine has recently received its first Skynex systems. And while you might expect those systems to deliver the sort of counter-UAS performance that only the combination of 35mm programmable ammunition, top-tier sensors, high degrees of automation, and German engineering standards can possibly deliver, we should probably also only expect them to deliver that kind of exceptional performance around one or two critical locations. Because in a country as large as Ukraine, 2 batteries of a short-range system only go so far. At this point, if our assumptions are correct, the Ukrainian air defence system, and to an extent possibly the Russian one as well, might be compared to a too small blanket. It has some very dangerous systems in inventory and can provide cover against some of the most capable high-end threats that Russia has to offer. But what it can't realistically do is provide that cover everywhere, all the time, against every threat. When making these sort of assessments, though, it's always important to check your data-driven model against observed reality. And given that it sometimes seems that not a month can pass without an assessment that one side or the other's air defence system is at the absolute brink of collapse, I thought it might be worth a quick reality check on some of what we've seen recently. For example, we can set some upper limits on the current state of the Ukrainian air defence system by looking at the extensive damage to Ukrainian infrastructure and also the status of the front line. If we got to the point where every city had a Patriot battery and there was a Gepard in every backyard, we wouldn't expect many missiles to make their way to infrastructure targets, nor VKS aircraft to feel safe glide bombing close to the front line. But many power stations have been hit and the glide bombs fall by the hundreds, and so Ukraine probably doesn't have an infinite supply of Patriots and equivalent systems. At the same time, though, as a sort of lower bound, you have to accept the Ukrainian air defence system is very much intact and still very dangerous. If you want an attestation to that, forget what both sides claim for a moment, just watch how the Russians fly. If Ukrainian GBAD wasn't considered to be very dangerous, you probably wouldn't see Sukhoi 34s limiting themselves to hurling standoff munitions from far on the Russian side of the border. They'd probably be ranging deep into enemy territory, the same way we've seen American aircraft fly during past campaigns, going after all sorts of critical targets, not just frontline trenches. You can also look at some of the recent footage that's come out of the Ukrainian cross-border road trip. In it, we've seen a number of Russian aircraft, including Sukhoi 25s, flying at very low level, despite the fact this is inside internationally recognised Russian territory. Flying very, very low is something we've seen both sides do in Ukraine to limit the threat posed by long and medium-range air defence systems. The trade-off, though, isn't just going to be increased fuel consumption, you're also putting yourself in range of systems like MANPADS, which we've seen shoot down a number of Sukhoi 25s in the past. Suffice to say, that would probably be a pretty strange way to fly if you thought your opponent was effectively out of long and medium-range threats. You can probably apply a similar bounding logic to Russia's air defence system. If it had been critically degraded, we probably wouldn't see Ukraine relying on things like saturation attacks in order to get through defences and hit critical targets. But if Russia had everything it needed in terms of air defence resources and the system was perfectly efficient, things probably wouldn't be exploding as often in Russia or the occupied territories. So the interesting question for us then is probably how are both sides using the air defence systems that they do have, how are they innovating, and where might some of the potential lessons and observations for other forces be? So let's start with the Ukrainians then. How do they appear to be using their air defence assets and what sort of innovations have we seen from them? I suspect a lot of what we see from the Ukrainians here is shaped by two key factors. Firstly, this is a force that is always going to be dealing with significant resource constraints. They're simply never going to have enough radars, launchers and missiles to do everything they want to do all the time. And building off that, the level of equipment quality also varies wildly. Ukraine's inventory basically runs the full gamut, from state-of-the-art systems capable of intercepting hypersonic and ballistic threats, all the way back to somewhat updated versions of 1960s designs. It's a high-low mix with a very wide capability gap. The same applies when you're talking about short-range air defences or self-propelled anti-aircraft guns. Ukraine does have nearly 100 of the German Gepards with their radars and fire control systems. But they have hundreds more vehicles that probably look a bit more like the image on the top right there, with heavy machine guns standing in for the 35mm cannon, and Pavel's no-scope skills replacing the computerized fire control. From a purely resource management perspective then, one of the key challenges you expect Ukraine to constantly face is how do they get the most out of their high-end capabilities while doing as much of the job as possible with the cheaper, more available systems. So to demonstrate in a very oversimplified way how Ukraine might be dealing with those kinds of resource limitations, let's talk briefly about the two main ways we've seen Ukraine use its best air defence system, the American-built Patriot. On one hand, we've seen Patriot used to provide protection for critical targets, specifically for Kyiv itself. Patriot is one of the few options the Ukrainians have for trying to deal with things like hypersonic and ballistic missiles. So using a battery to help protect Kyiv, its critical government buildings and large population from those threats makes a degree of sense. But 1, 2, 6 or 7 batteries aren't going to be enough to provide that sort of protection everywhere. And even with Kyiv itself, protection might be inconsistent due to competing demands on the launchers, shortages of available missiles, saturation attacks overwhelming the system, or plain old bad luck. The basic point here is that Ukraine has a strong incentive to have the maximum possible impact, using as few missiles and systems as possible. And so we've seen Ukraine be very mobile with some of its other Patriot assets, playing a sort of air defence shell game. Ideally, Patriot launchers are quietly moved to a section of the front and then used to stage a surface-to-air missile ambush, or SAMBUSH. While potentially quite risky for the battery in question, it also imposes a dilemma on the VKS. If they fly their aircraft closer to the line of contact, where they can be more accurate and hit targets deeper into Ukrainian territory, then if a Patriot does pop up, they're going to lose valuable airframes. But the only way to fully minimise that risk, in the absence of good intelligence as to where the Ukrainian Patriot batteries actually are at all times, is potentially to treat an awful lot of Ukrainian airspace like it might be covered by a Patriot at any given time. Reported Ukrainian employment of this tactic appeared to drop off for a while as the Russian missile campaign intensified and Ukraine's supply of Patriot systems and interceptors dropped to a low. But with more batteries and interceptors now arriving, it'll be interesting to see if we see this tactic revived. As well as trying to use stealth, surprise, and mobility to get the most out of their high-end assets, Ukraine has also had to look for solutions on the lower end. For example, there are nowhere near enough man-pads and short-range missiles available to Ukraine to fire them against every incoming Shahed attack drone. Instead, what we've seen is Ukraine rely more and more on drone hunting teams, using things like heavy machine guns, autocannons, and even handheld firearms. The way this reportedly works is that various sensors are used to detect the incoming drones, including networked acoustic sensors, which is a fancy way of saying there are probably a bunch of microphones out there, networked and listening for things that sound like particularly murderous lawnmowers. And that information is then used to get drone hunting teams into position, whether that be technicals like the one you see on screen there, or something more advanced like a Gepard. And while drone hunting teams like that are relatively specific to threats like Shahed, we've also seen a number of Ukrainian adaptations aimed at bringing down Russian reconnaissance drones. Systems like the Russian Orlan are nothing fancy, and Ukraine probably can't get away with firing missiles at every single one that flies deep into their territory. But at the same time, there's a massive incentive for Ukraine to try and eliminate them wherever possible, because Orlans and other drones like them can provide a critical service for Russian forces, spotting targets and enabling strikes by things like loitering munitions, guided artillery shells, all the way up to tactical ballistic missiles like Iskander. And so in order to inhibit Russia's ability to launch those kind of strikes, we've seen Ukraine get very creative. For example, we've seen video evidence of the Ukrainians using ultralight aircraft to fly alongside Russian reconnaissance drones, while a second crew member shoots it down using a handheld weapon. You can see an image of one such engagement on the right there. This is literally taking military aviation all the way back to the kind of thing you might have seen in the earlier stages of World War I, where you have a very light aircraft with a handheld weapon as its primary armament. On the face of it, that sort of concept might seem fairly ridiculous on a modern battlefield which features supersonic jets capable of yeeting advanced missiles over the horizon. But when you think about it, an aircraft doesn't have to be particularly quick to catch up with some of these drones, and you probably wouldn't expect Russian S-400 batteries, for example, to be slinging long-range missiles at what is essentially a crop duster flying at very low altitude. Arguably the most famous example of this technique was the propeller-powered Yak-52 training aircraft the Ukrainians appeared to be flying around Odessa. The image you see on the right there is actually a Russian drone operator's view as the Yak-52 came into view. In the case of that aircraft, some reporting indicates the rear gunner may have used a shotgun, at least on some occasions, which I think makes it abundantly clear to all of us what the next shooting event added at the 2028 Olympics should be. Some Russian sources complained quite bitterly and credited this aircraft with a double-digit number of Russian reconnaissance drones brought down. One Russian blogger complained the Yak-52 crew was, quote, firing at our UAVs like it's a shooting gallery, end quote. The Russian MOD would claim to destroy one Yak-52 with a machine gun mount in July, but if Ukraine decides to further employ the tactic, I can't imagine equipment availability would be that much of an issue as long as there are pilots and gunners available to fly them. But perhaps an example of a more significant and scalable solution than airborne skeet shooting has been the apparent adaptation of drones to hunt drones. To do that, we've seen them adapted with a wide array of cutting-edge weapon systems. For example, the video on the right there shows one drone taking out another, using one of humanity's most battle-proven and capable weapon systems, the Stick. Yes, this is a big war with a lot of drones being used, and so you would expect to see some interesting stuff. But if I told you in February 2022 that 2.5 years later, you could have a video folder labelled Stick Air-to-Air Kills, I'm not sure what sort of reception I would have received. Probably more significant than the stick-based engagements, however, have just been conventional FPV interceptions of reconnaissance drones. Here, provided the approach can be made to work at least some of the time, the math very much checks out. FPVs are going to be more available and affordable than these reconnaissance drones, and these engagements are also comparatively more likely to take place in areas where the traditional defences against FPVs may not be as available. Russian and Ukrainian electronic warfare units, for example, may be a serious problem for each other's drone teams. But if you have reconnaissance drones operating deep behind enemy lines, they're probably going to be a long way away from powerful, ground-based friendly emitters. And if I was going to make a tentative prediction, it would be that the forces involved are likely to increase their capability to launch these kinds of interceptions as time goes on. The tactics that make it possible appear to be rapidly evolving, to the point where I'm not comfortable talking about them online yet. And from a design perspective, there's every reason to believe that further adaptation and optimization is possible. Your standard FPV in Ukraine, if there is such a thing, hasn't generally been designed with air-to-air interception in mind. And Ukraine's attempts to convert FPVs into hillbilly surface-to-air missiles haven't just targeted Russian drones, we've also seen attacks on Russian helicopters. Ukraine's recent foray across the Russian border has already given us a range of interesting footage, including that of some attempted FPV attacks on Russian rotary-winged assets. To date, there appear to have been at least 2 claimed hits causing at least some damage, one on an Mi-28 attack helicopter pictured, and the other on an Mi-8 transport helicopter. In both cases, Russian sources claim the helicopters in question were only damaged, not destroyed, but the concept has obviously been demonstrated, adding yet another potential threat to the Russian helicopter force that has already had a pretty bumpy war. There are probably 3 quick points to make about the potential use of things like FPVs as ersatz anti-aircraft munitions to target opposing helicopters. The first point is that even if this doesn't work most of the time, the difference in cost involved is so great that if it works one time in 1,000, it's still a bloody bargain. The second is I can't imagine we're seeing all images of attempted engagements of helicopters, and I imagine there are a lot more failures than there are successes. Hitting a moving aerial target with an FPV is going to be difficult. A lot of helicopters have relatively high performance. Airflow near the rotors might affect the drone in unexpected ways, and the warheads that tend to be mounted to FPVs are not optimised for engaging aerial targets. That said, in Ukraine, FPVs and loitering munitions can evolve very, very quickly. And going forward, we may start to see systems appear that are all the more efficient at engaging these kinds of targets. Dedicated FPV interceptors are already a concept, although they probably have a long way to evolve yet. But we've already started to see published examples of FPV warheads, for example, that are specifically designed to knock down opposing drones, not destroy armoured or personnel targets. The adaptation has started and will likely continue. For now, this is more an example of an interesting Ukrainian adaptation than a decisive tool. The most recent confirmed Russian Kar-52 loss was reportedly to a manpads, not an FPV drone. But in an environment where there may not always be enough manpads to go around, this might provide another solution to give units at least something. Another chapter out of the Ukrainian manual on how to deal with a larger air force without enough air defence systems has been to focus on counter-air, not just anti-air operations. Essentially, instead of just always trying to shoot down Russian aircraft, Ukraine has repeatedly attempted to target the aircraft and their supporting infrastructure on the ground. Just from first principles, you can probably see why that sort of approach might be attractive to Kyiv. A fighter in the air can be a difficult-to-locate, agile target. Runways and ammo depots, however, don't tend to do particularly well on dodge checks. In 2023, we saw a number of high-profile Ukrainian counter-air strikes. The use of ATACMS missiles against Russian helicopter bases, for example, caused significant losses and, at least for a time, did a lot to degrade the effectiveness of those helicopter units along certain sections of the front. Unfortunately for Ukraine, the ATACMS missiles used in those strikes only arrived after the helicopters in question had already done serious damage to the Ukrainian mid-year offensive. In 2024, however, there are probably other factors pushing Ukraine towards more of these counter-air strikes. Firstly, Russian glide bombing attacks have become more and more of a problem for Ukrainian forces, which puts an incentive in place to find a way to stop them. And secondly, attacks against Russian airfields allow Ukraine to leverage one of the few weapon systems it has available in relative abundance, its long-range one-way attack drones. And to get an idea of what this has looked like, I want to take a look at just one recent high-profile strike. This is an image of Russia's Morozovsk airbase in the Rostov region before its recent explosive remodeling. The base has been used by the Russian Air Force throughout the invasion and has been targeted by Ukrainian drones on a number of separate occasions. There was reportedly a drone attack in April, followed by another in June. Then, earlier this month, another attack was launched, again reportedly using a double-digit number of attack drones. At least initially, the reporting was, as it often is, pretty conflicted. There were Russian commentators claiming, for example, that no one had been wounded, no aircraft had been damaged, and everything was more or less fine. Apparently, however, that definition of fine included the airbase burning so brightly that this is what it looked like on NASA's firm's satellite fire detection system. Cheap one-way attack drones don't tend to carry particularly large warheads, and you wouldn't normally expect to see this sort of profile that you can quite literally detect from space. Instead, the most likely version of what appears to have happened is that the Ukrainians brought a limited amount of high explosive to the table, paid a visit to the Russian ammunition depot on base, and the Russians then contributed their own high explosive stockpiles to creating one heck of a secondary explosion. This is what one section of Morozovsk Air Base reportedly looked like after that detonation. As you can see, entire buildings have been utterly erased, and there's still some scattered evidence around of some of the valuable ordnance that was likely being stored on site. The weapons you see on screen there, for example, are reported to be Russian laser-guided bombs, massing about 1.5 tons each. And as for the claim that no Russian aircraft were damaged, that may or may not be true, but the Sukhoi 34 on screen here was very much destroyed. It was initially visible on satellite imagery, and then we got this very helpful follow-up photograph. And if that constitutes merely cosmetic damage, I'd hate to see what the VKS insurance agency considers to be a write-off. On one hand, we only have visual evidence for the destruction of a single aircraft. On the other hand, that single airframe probably cost more than every drone used in the Ukrainian strike, to say nothing of the destroyed ordnance or base infrastructure. Despite the success of this and some other Ukrainian attacks, it's hard not to feel that some opportunity may have been missed here. Ukraine has primarily been launching these attacks on airfields in internationally recognised Russian territory using its long-range attack drones, not tactical ballistic missiles like ATACMS provided by its allies. Permission to do so was very publicly and repeatedly requested, and just as publicly and repeatedly denied. We can't be confident exactly what the effect of adding TBMs to some of these Ukrainian strikes might have been, but the evidence suggests that they could have made a difference. Ukrainian and Russian TBMs have repeatedly been used to attack airfields in Ukrainian territory. An ATACMS missile is going to be more difficult to intercept than your average long-range attack drone, and the potential damage is also significantly greater. As we saw with the attacks on Russian helicopter bases back in 2023, just a small number or even a single ATACMS missile with a submunition payload can cover a significant area with tiny submunitions. Helicopters and jets tend to be relatively fragile, and so if the weather report changes over to sunny with a mild chance of high explosive rain, good luck passing your pre-flight inspections the next day. At the moment, drones simply can't deliver either the area of effect of a missile carrying a cluster payload, nor the devastation to hardened targets that can be caused by a unitary warhead. But perhaps the biggest difference between drones and TBMs for these kind of attacks is simply warning time. In the case of both recently attacked Russian air bases, Morozovsk and Lipetsk, satellite data suggests that prior to the attacks being launched, there were a significant number of Russian fixed-wing aircraft at the location. But, at least at Lipetsk, Russian sources claim the aircraft were able to take off and evacuate before the drones arrived. Now yes, forcing aircraft to scramble like that might bring certain advantages, and we'll talk about those in a moment, but the fact remains, they probably weren't on the ground when the drones finally arrived. One of the reasons that drones tend to be cheap is that they tend to be slow, and slow can mean extended warning times. Something like a TBM is probably going to offer much quicker target service. And with the kind of expedited delivery that only rocket motors can offer, the chance of those aircraft getting into the air before the missiles arrive is probably going to be much reduced. That increases the odds that a strike doesn't just destroy static targets like ammunition depots as they did at Morozovsk and Lipetsk, or by inhibiting Russian operations by forcing them to not do certain maintenance activities at these forward air bases and only keep aircraft that can scramble on short notice, but instead actually permanently destroy airframes. All of that only works, however, if the Russian aerospace forces don't put the requisite adaptations in place. And on that point, the clock is probably ticking. Over time, Russia might get better at avoiding the worst potential impacts of these strikes, for example by shifting where they base their aircraft. The Russian system can be slow to change, but it's kind of hard to ignore it when your airfields keep doing their best impression of a supernova. But speaking of the Russian system, at this point you might be asking, how has their approach to air and missile defense been any different to Ukraine's? And as we're about to see, I think the evidence suggests that Russia's mode of utilization when it comes to air defenses is just a bit more, shall we say, prolific. Russia's current air defense system is arguably shaped by its Soviet heritage. And the Soviet air defense system was built for a conflict with NATO, not Ukraine. And so of all the ground-based elements of the Russian military, the air defense forces were probably the most overbuilt relative to the scale of the war in Ukraine. However you graph it, cut it, or define it, Russia has a shit ton of air defenses. And so if you're an analyst looking for potential bottlenecks or points of failure, getting the number of launches down to zero probably isn't a reasonable or useful metric. Instead, we're looking for elements that might force Russia to change how it's using its air defence systems or to prevent it achieving its goals with them. And so going forward, I'd nominate 3 points to watch. Does Russia have enough interceptor missiles to shoot down all of the stuff it wants to shoot down? Does it have enough radars to make all of its launches effective? And does it have enough systems to cover all of the geography it wants to cover against all of the threats it wants to counter? In a sense, that's an area where Russian geography and resources can act as both a strength and a weakness. Russia can have a lot of air defences, but it also has a lot of Russia to defend. And so we're mostly concerned with how that system is currently performing and likely to perform in the future, given the context of this war. And for the purpose of just a quick illustrative overview today, I think it works to break this down into 3 questions. What sort of things is the Russian air defence shooting at? How many of those things is it shooting at? And what is it shooting at them with? Because in all cases, I think the answer might be different than it is on just the other side of the front line. There's 2 main ways we can go about attacking those questions. We can use Ukrainian and international reports as well as satellite data, as we have in previous episodes. But this episode, to build on that information, I want to bring in some of what the Russians themselves are reporting, because the Russian MOD literally provides day-by-day updates on claimed successful air defence engagements. And even if we have reason to believe that the underlying numbers of those claims may be about as reliable as a fortune cookie trying to predict the stock market, there still might be some useful patterns to glean. Starting with the question of what the Russian air defence system claims to be shooting at. Remember, we just went over the evidence suggesting that the Ukrainian air defence system has to be relatively selective in what targets it chooses to engage, or at least what weapons it chooses to engage them with. The Russian data, by contrast, claims a slightly less picky target set, perhaps operating under the reasoning that if you have the missiles, you may as well use them. For example, remember how I just said the Ukrainians don't tend to fire missiles at glide bombs? Ever since the French announced earlier this year that they were going to be sending the Ukrainians about 50 Hammer precision-guided bombs per month, we've been seeing them appear in Russian claim data. And looking at some of the most recent data, for the 28 days, 6 July to 2nd August 2024, the Russians claimed to have shot down 40 Hammers, essentially implying that Ukraine was using all of the bombs it was receiving, and about 80% of them were being shot down by Russian air defences. And I use the word shot down there very deliberately for reasons we'll come back to in a moment. But straight off the bat, I'd suggest that this is a class of systems the Russians say they are shooting at that the Ukrainians probably wouldn't. And even if the jury was still out on that one, it gets a little clearer. Russian attention, both military and propaganda, has long focused, arguably disproportionately, on HIMARS units in Ukraine. Over the course of more than 2 years of operations at this point, the launches themselves have proven rather slippery targets, although the Russians do regularly claim to destroy them. Much more regularly claimed than the launches themselves, however, are the rockets they fire. Large, difficult-to-replace ATACMS TBMs, fired one from a HIMARS pod, are regularly reported as air defence kill claims. During the most recent full 28-day period I have data for, the Russians claimed roughly 1 ATACMS shot down per day. But it was the much cheaper, much smaller GIMLRS rockets, also fired from HIMARS, that dominated Russia's claimed rocket interceptions. And while absolutely you can imagine situations where a GIMLRS rocket might be about to hit a very valuable target, and as a result you feel like you have enough interceptor missiles available to task 1 or 2 to attempt to intercept it, the presence of other munitions on the list, I think, raises questions as to just how picky they claim to be being. Because there's another rocket type that has appeared multiple times on Russia's air defence claims over those 28 days, fired from a Czech system called Vampire. Now, much to the disappointment of some of you, I'm sure, the Vampire does not in fact fire containerised members of the von Karstein family at your opponents. Instead, it's a relatively run-of-the-mill, unguided rocket artillery system firing Soviet-style 122mm artillery rockets, the same as the famous Grad. When I first started seeing this appear in Russian claims, I wondered whether they were getting mixed up between this and the other Vampire system which has been sent to Ukraine, which is a truck-mounted, light-guided rocket system intended for destroying drones and similar targets. Maybe I figured they were talking about destroying entire trucks and someone got confused. But the way the official Russian English-language MOD release frames it doesn't really leave much room to question. On the 4th of August, for example, they specifically say they shot down one Vampire MLRS projectile, meaning it is the rocket, not a system, and by referring to them separately as Czech-built, they basically confirm they are talking about this system, firing only the finest in unguided Soviet-style 122mm firecrackers. So from what we're getting so far, the solution to aircraft is air defence, the solution to bombs is air defence, the solution to guided and unguided artillery rockets is, again, air defence, but you might be a tad more surprised if I told you that air defence was also apparently the chosen Russian solution to air defence. Over the sample period I looked at, Russia claimed to have shot down about 14 Ukrainian surface-to-air missiles, mostly American Patriots. And again, I'm not talking about the launches, I'm talking about the missiles they fire. Now, especially if your goal is to defend things like valuable aircraft in Russian territory, that may not be as strange as it sounds. You can imagine situations like the Ukrainians firing a missile at an AWACS aircraft deep in Russian territory, where you may want to attempt this sort of interception. But as a potential target, you have to imagine a PAC-2 missile isn't going to be particularly easy. It's going to be just over 16 inches in diameter, 5 metres long, and quite potentially booking it at about 3 times the speed of sound. To make that sort of intercept happen reliably, you'd probably want your launchers in the right place, and you'd probably want to be ripple firing, launching multiple interceptors against each target in order to maximise the probability of a hit. Again, I'm not saying this is impossible at all, just that it's another resource-demanding task to put on your air defence network. A glib answer to our earlier question then of what is Russia firing air defence against would basically be yes. Even more so when you take account of the use of air defence missiles, specifically S-300s, adapted into the ground attack role. Russia has the larger air defence system, but it also claims to be making it at least partially responsible for a much wider array of threats. The second big part of our question then is what is being used to make a lot of these intercepts? Because from a sustainability and bottleneck perspective, there's a big difference between bringing stuff down using electronic warfare for the equivalent of a couple of bucks a shot and fully embracing the Saudi approach of yeeting full-size interceptors at hobby drones. I think the evidence has been clear for a while now that Russian electronic warfare in Ukraine plays a massive role in a variety of ways. It gathers intelligence, inhibits communications, is one of the primary defences against things like FPVs, and it's also commonly used to both diminish the accuracy of GPS-guided weapons and to try and bring down long-range one-way attack drones. That second part is probably important from a sustainability perspective, considering the Russians claim to be shooting down something like 2,000 of those per month. But when you're talking about shoot-down specifically, rather than things that are rendered less accurate on their way into their target, hard kill systems are still very obviously a major part of the picture. For example, we have plenty of evidence of Russia trying to use short and medium-range air defence missiles to defend point targets against things like air-launched cruise missiles. That includes things like video, helpfully taken by a Russian Panzer crew of them ripple-firing 2 missiles against a Storm Shadow missile, missing both times, a video which was notably followed a little bit later in 2023 by an announcement in Russian state media that the Panzer had subsequently been upgraded to increase its efficiency against certain targets. A representative of Rostec was quoted as saying, "All necessary alterations have been introduced to the Panzer S system, making it possible to increase its efficiency against difficult projectiles and long-range missiles, including the long-range, low-visibility Storm Shadow cruise missile. The results of its combat use have proven the correctness of previously made design decisions." End quote. Put that all together, and the Russian information at least suggests that they were using short-range missiles fired by Panzer against these sort of targets. It wasn't working perfectly well, and an upgrade was subsequently made. That same article also notably says that the upgraded Panzer system has a 100% success rate against HIMARS missiles, which is a fairly firm suggestion that Russia has been trying to use hard-kill solutions against Gimler's projectiles. And not just cheap short-range systems, Russian sources talk about using the big stuff against Gimler's rounds as well. Specifically, we're talking about the use of full-size S-300 interceptors and Buk missiles to bring down Gimler's rounds. And at least if we believe the Russians, this was neither a case of isolated incidents or a limited bound of time. In April 2023, the press centre for the Russian Zapad group of forces was quoted as saying the following: "In the defence area of the 1st Tank Army, the armed forces of Ukraine attempted to launch a missile strike using the HIMARS MLRS against Russian positions close to Pokrovskoye. As a result of the coordinated work of Buk and S-300 SAM teams, all the missiles were intercepted." End quote. The Russian MOD report for the day claimed 13 Gimler's rockets and 1 HARM anti-radiation missile shot down. Another report from the same period referred to 2 Gimler's and 3 unguided Soviet-era MLRS projectiles again being shot down by S-300 and Buk surface-to-air missiles. Jump more than a year forward and you still get stories like the one on the bottom right, with the Russian Ministry of Defense itself releasing a report bragging about how Buk surface-to-air missiles of the Vostok group of forces, so a different unit on a different part of the front than previously, was again able to destroy several Gimler's projectiles. If you make a series of optimistic assumptions in Russia's favour, like every one of these intercepts is being done by a single missile with no ripple firing, despite us having videos of them ripple firing on multiple occasions, and that there are no failed intercepts resulting in wasted missiles, and that despite S-300 being mentioned, it's not actually being used, only Buk is, That's already a pretty abysmal shot exchange picture and potentially problematic given that Lockheed Martin's at their current productive capacity of 10,000 GMLRS rounds per year, pushing towards 14,000. And if you start factoring in things like potential misses, ripple firing, and the use of full-size S-300 and S-400 interceptors, this whole practice moves further and further into shotguns versus sandflies territory, as well as essentially putting yourself in an asymmetric money-burning competition against the United States, European Union, and Ukraine's various other allies. And from a personal perspective, while you might see this as an unfortunately necessary emergency measure for force protection reasons from the Russian perspective, I'm not sure why it's something you would brag about, because it's essentially providing your opponent a partial blueprint on how they might be able to further stress your air defense system using one of the few resources they have available in reasonable numbers. A more useful narrative instead might be that all the work in question was being done by electronic warfare. But if you did that, the commanders of the missile batteries presumably wouldn't get their bonuses, and you can't have that now. You also probably can't assume that Russia is just lying about using missiles for a lot of these things. It is entirely reliant on electronic warfare instead, because a lot of the targets in question just don't have reliable EW counters. And that's arguably true on both ends of the spectrum. Missiles like Storm Shadow aren't entirely reliant on the kind of systems you might be able to interfere with, like GNS or data links. The missile is also capable of doing things like reading the terrain it is flying over in order to work out where it is. So unless you are literally willing to do things like move mountains and build new roads and landmarks in between the time when the missile is programmed and when it arrives at its target, good luck. And I think the accuracy of Storm Shadow and Scalp so far against targets that would almost certainly have heavy layered protection of all kinds, like targets in Sevastopol itself on Crimea, probably speaks for itself in that regard. At the other end of the spectrum, a lot of the ATACMS missiles we've seen used don't use GPS, they're INS only. And those rockets being fired and intercepted from the Czech Vampire aren't guided at all. Trying to counter an unguided weapon using electronic warfare is kind of like trying to get a rock drunk or breaching a brick wall by sweet-talking it. So I think it's reasonable to take the Russians at least partly at their word here and suggest that if those intercepts are happening, hard kill systems are probably involved. That brings us to the question of scale, which is important because it helps us determine the possible requirement for Russian air defense systems. If you're intercepting a wide array of incoming, but only in a couple of places and only some of the time, that's a very different resource demand picture to if you're trying to do it everywhere. And at least according to the Russians, they're very much taking an everywhere all the time approach. For the less than 2 months between the 8th of June and 2nd of August 2024, the Russian MOD officially claimed the following had been shot down by their air defense systems: 9 Ukrainian fixed-wing aircraft, 53 ATACMS, 26 Storm Shadows and Neptunes, 359 multiple rocket launch projectiles, 14 surface-to-air missiles, primarily Patriots, 3,513 unmanned systems, noting there that they don't include things like FPVs in those totals, and then 7 other, mostly HARM anti-radiation missiles. That provides a very rough baseline of 500 claimed successful interceptions per week, of which about 60 are non-drone targets. Assuming that 100% of those drones were brought down by electronic warfare rather than missiles, there were no unsuccessful interception attempts, and that of all those other targets that were destroyed, 2 interceptors were on average ripple fired against each target, that would imply an interceptor consumption rate of about 120 per week, with most of those being fired against artillery rockets like GMLRS and Vampire. You might recall that the Estonian Ministry of Defence estimated that Ukraine's requirement for air defence interceptors was trending towards 400 per month. The assumptions we've just gone over would already suggest that Russia is firing more than that on a monthly basis, despite Ukraine having a much smaller air force, and without factoring in any failed interceptions or usage against drones. Obviously, there are a lot of assumptions built into that, but it's interesting to see what an apparent difference in targeting priority can do to consumption rates. Now, of course, there's plenty of reason to believe the Russian MOD has a bit of form when it comes to overclaiming. The aircraft claims, for example, are interesting, considering that according to Russia's official numbers, the Ukrainians ran out of aircraft a long time ago, which I can only presume means the ghost of Kyiv is real and the Russians are succeeding in shooting down phantom aircraft with undead pilots. But with that caveat in place, here's the last 8 full weeks of official Russian claim data when it comes to air defense shootdowns. The color coding breaks the claims down by type, so fixed-wing aircraft, tactical ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, MRL projectiles, surface-to-air missiles, and other. And what immediately stands out is that you can see a fairly steady cadence of claims against tactical ballistic missiles and MRL projectiles, whereas things like Storm Shadow and Neptune missiles tend to be much more concentrated. If those patterns, if not the quantities, in any way reflect reality, it would suggest that things like TBMs and MRLs are being used on a fairly consistent basis, while Ukrainian Storm Shadow and Neptune strikes are much less frequent, going after only the most critical of targets. The claims for larger reconnaissance and one-way attack UAVs also have a base level of consistency, but with definite spikes. Over that time period, there was no week where Russia claimed to shoot down fewer than 300 UAVs, but the number spiked to more than 600 in the period 20 to 26 July. The Russians also provide, albeit inconsistently, figures for what percentage of those shootdowns are taking place outside what they call the SMO zone, so inside Russia proper. Over the course of that time period, that figure ranged very roughly from around 30 to 60%. And there have been days, I think 3rd August was the most recent example at time of recording, where Russia claims to have shot down more targets inside Russia than in Ukraine or the occupied territories. That provides further confirmation, I think, that they're not talking about shooting down FPVs, but rather longer range systems. And secondly, that a lot of Russia's claimed air defence work, and thus consequently probably also its systems, are having to be dispersed across threatened Russian territory. Even once you account for the reliability or lack thereof of official Russian data, when you start to combine all of that with some of the things we've looked at in previous episodes in terms of demonstrated and recorded strikes, as well as video evidence we've seen and claims from the Ukrainians and other foreign commentators, I do think you can stitch together at least a cautious picture. On one hand, it suggests that the ground-based Russian air defence system is still very large, very capable, and the Russians are leaning on it in order to deal with a wide array of threats. Everything from aircraft down to artillery rockets. In terms of how sustainable and effective that approach is likely to be going forward, it's hard to say. Back in January, Sergei Shoigu, at that point still defence minister, said that Russia had roughly doubled its production of air defence missiles from pre-war levels. That would probably be a significant but reasonable industrial achievement, but probably nowhere near enough if your intention is to keep firing Buks and S-300s at Gimler's rounds. On the flip side, however, Russia doesn't just have new production air defence missiles, it also has old Soviet stockpiles. And given we know just how deep Ukraine's inventory of inherited missiles went, it's hard to imagine the Russian inventories not being significantly larger. Realistically, I think what the math suggests is that from both a usage and destruction perspective, it's probably unrealistic to expect the Ukrainians to knock out the Russian air defence system. Instead, what might be much more realistic is what we've arguably already seen, the Ukrainians attempting to degrade and stretch the air defence system. The combination of diverse threats on a continuous basis across a wide geography basically requires the Russians to stretch and stretch their very formidable resources. That may create an environment where, sure, Ukrainian long-range systems aren't able to hit every target they try and engage, but for comparatively little investment, they are occasionally able to get through, as examples like the recent Morozovsk air base strike show. A final point here is that the way Russia is currently using its air defence systems might provide us something of a clue as to how it actually views the world, or specifically, how much it actually views NATO as a genuine threat. A core Russian talking point is that NATO represents a clear and present military threat to the Russian Federation, and the Kremlin has often claimed that it was the prospect of Ukraine joining NATO that forced, in inverted commas, the invasion of February 2022. I've unpacked those statements in the past, but the point where air defences come in is that while Russia describes NATO as a threat publicly, its forced dispositions and the way it uses its military often suggests otherwise. Russia has stripped military resources away from its borders with various NATO states, and seems content to expend enormous amounts of air defence munitions in Ukraine, including firing air defence missiles against ground targets in the case of the S-300, which doesn't strike me as something that you would choose to do if you genuinely expected you might at some point get into a shooting war with NATO. You know, that alliance that has thousands upon thousands of combat aircraft available, including high-end threats like stealth bombers and fifth-generation fighters, as well as a proven penchant for fighting air-led campaigns. I don't know about you, but if I genuinely thought I might get into a brawl with the United States Air Force any day now, I'd probably be hoarding more of my air defence missiles, not bragging about how I was using them to shoot down artillery rockets at a rate of more than 2,300 per year. So now that we've talked about the differences in air defence utilisation by both sides, let's pivot and have a chat about potential observations. Obviously, these come with a significant degree of uncertainty, and they might be shaped by the unique context that we see in Ukraine. But if you're talking about observations other forces around the world might take from all this, let's start with this one. Ideally, you really, really need a way to take away the advantages your opponent gets by having their reconnaissance drones up. Here I'm not talking so much about very cheap quad rotors that really only have the range to operate near the front line, or larger medium altitude long endurance drones like the TB2, Reaper or the Chinese GJ1, that do have the range and sensors to go further, but are probably large enough and expensive enough to be dealt with using conventional air defence missiles without too much of a shot exchange problem. The threatening gap, at least in Ukraine at the moment, are the drones in the middle. Think things like the Russian Orlan and Supercam drones or their Western equivalents. Units that are going to have the range and endurance to go well behind the lines, loiter and gather useful amounts of information, while at the same time being cheap enough and available enough to potentially be a real air defence problem. So far, it seems that a lot of the traditional answers to these kind of systems, things like manpads, have been useful but at the same time limited. Anecdotal reports suggest that some manpads, in particular older systems, sometimes struggle to acquire and engage smaller targets with a limited heat signature. And while some newer systems, like the UK's Martlet, do have a better reputation in that regard, the problems of availability and cost are very obviously there. Hence, a lot of the strange adaptations we've seen, especially from the Ukrainians, to try and find a more affordable, available way to bring these things down. Now, personally, I doubt the Pentagon will be issuing any contracts for stick-armed drones in the near future, but just in case I'm wrong, I could potentially be very happy to offer up a supply of battle-proven, lightweight carbon counter-UAS projectiles, and you know what? I might be happy to offer a mates rates price of a couple of grand per unit. Realistically, though, the threat of reconnaissance drones is probably going to call for something a little more sophisticated. I will note that many militaries around the world don't appear to be blind to the potential threat that these kind of systems face and are attempting to roll out new and improved countermeasures. Those include things like updated short-range air defence systems that feature mixed cannon, machine gun, rocket and missile armaments like the one you see on the right there, and also things like dedicated interceptor drones, although, so far at least, much more expensive and more complex ones than what we've seen in Ukraine. The Anduril Roadrunner you see on the right there, for example, in its M variant, is designed to be a vertical takeoff interceptor that can go after a variety of targets, including opposing reconnaissance drones. It's intended to be recoverable and reusable if it doesn't make an interception, although it's disposable if it does. Whatever the solution or mix of solutions, though, it's pretty clear that the ability to counter opposing ISR drones is not an optional extra. Because as we've repeatedly seen in Ukraine, the systems are there for forces like the Russian and Ukrainian militaries to take the data provided by long-range reconnaissance drones and convert that into very damaging strikes, including against opposing air defence systems. And that logic seems to apply across a range of air defence systems and range brackets. Closer to the front line, we have repeatedly seen short and medium-range air defence systems engaged by threats like FPVs, loitering munitions, and of course, Gimler's rockets. The image you see on the right there is taken from a video of Ukrainian FPVs engaging two Russian Tor air defence systems. But I could easily have used any number of other examples in order to demonstrate all of the problems these systems could face. For example, in the case of a recent reported loss of a pair of Russian Pantsir systems, there again appears to have been an issue detecting and identifying the threatening drones. In this case, they didn't apparently fail to spot and shoot down Ukrainian kamikaze drones, but rather Ukrainian reconnaissance drones. And those appear to have dialed a mate, called in a Gimler strike, and recorded the aftermath. Meanwhile, if you're talking about a responsive, dangerous threat to longer-range, more valuable air defence systems, even over much longer distances, one of the key standouts of this war so far has been the tactical ballistic missiles, the TBMs. Overwhelmingly, at least recently, that's been the Iskander on the Russian side and the ATACMS for the Ukrainians. In this apparent role of targeting enemy air defence missile batteries, TBMs have demonstrated a number of potential strengths. The combination of long range with short flying time, because, it's a ballistic missile, probably increases the odds that even a relatively small number of systems might be able to provide responsive fire against a target when it's spotted. You don't need the launcher to be pre-positioned in exactly the right spot when a target is eventually identified. Anywhere within a couple of 100 kilometres is going to do. And thanks to that relatively short flying time, your opponent might get relatively less warning and also be less likely to have just moved on or displaced by the time the weapon arrives. There's also just the point of TBMs in general being relatively hard for a lot of air defence systems to intercept, and we've definitely got evidence of that in Ukraine. That's not to say these missiles are impossible to intercept, and we have seen interceptions, but we've also seen some very notable failures. The image on the right there is taken from a video of a strike against a Russian air defence missile battery, where you see the launchers repeatedly apparently firing defensively against incoming ATACMS. We see multiple interceptor missiles being fired off, but it doesn't prevent the clusters very visibly raining down a little bit later on, and the battery subsequently suffering critical existence failure. On a number of occasions, Russian troops have also helpfully recorded video and images of the damage caused by these strikes, and then helpfully uploaded them to the internet. These images have often helped confirm that the vehicles in question aren't decoys, as well as the enormous damage that secondary detonations can cause. We also appear to have seen something similar on the Russian side with the deployment of Iskander missiles against Ukrainian Patriots. The only visually confirmed examples we have of Ukrainian TEL losses in the field so far appear to have been the result of an Iskander strike that was observed and potentially spotted for by a Russian reconnaissance drone. In this case, the vehicles appear to have been in a travel configuration, not deployed defensively, but a painful loss is very much still a painful loss. And when you look at further non-visually confirmed Russian claims of destroyed Patriots, again, Iskander tends to be mentioned a lot. In July, Russia claimed the destruction of 2 Patriot TLs near Odessa using Iskander-M ballistic missiles. The Ukrainians would then notably repost the footage that the Russians provided as evidence of that attack, claiming that those boxy objects you see on the bottom right there, that were apparently set up very close to each other, in the open, right by the water, were in fact decoys. The Russian footage also notably included some interesting cuts and no images or video of the aftermath, but the point here isn't so much whether a particular set of targets were decoys or not. It's that the combination of TBMs with reconnaissance drones has been a regular go-to for responsive, accurate strikes against high-value targets, including air defence systems. There's probably also a broader point here about just how demanding in terms of resources air and missile defence in Ukraine has been, and how that might shape the way that other forces choose to define their requirements. To oversimplify it, we've seen time and time again that different sorts of air defence systems can only optimise against certain sorts of threats. You need answers for threats ranging from enemy aircraft and high-end missiles at one extreme, all the way down to FPV drones on the other. That means making sure that your air defences themselves also have air defences, that they're properly networked and layered. But given how expensive and resource-intensive a lot of these assets can be, saying that is probably more easily and cheaply said than done. That's probably even more so the case when we've seen saturation and exhaustion tactics used with a degree of success. A lot more Ukrainian long-range drone attacks fail than appear to succeed. But where they do succeed, the damage done is often totally asymmetrical, as with these recent airbase strikes, and it forces a defender, if they want to be truly secure, to provide enough defences at every potential target to defend against the maximum possible intensity of attack. If I can launch up to 100 drones in a salvo and you have 20 potential airbases that I might target, you need to put enough defences in place at each of those airbases to be able to reliably handle up to 100 drones at once and be able to regenerate quickly enough that a repeat strike won't overwhelm those defences. That's absolutely not impossible. We've talked about possible future responses like directed energy weapons in the past. But it does highlight a bit the daunting defence economic challenge of this sort of air and missile defence. When the attacking weapons are so much cheaper than the potential targets, in order to be effective, the defenders have to get it right every single time. The attackers only have to get it right occasionally. All of that probably suggests a potential use for new types of anti-air systems. The war in Ukraine has already increased international interest in older types of short-range air defence systems like self-propelled anti-aircraft guns, but when it comes to things like adapting small and affordable drones or loitering munitions for anti-air use, I think we're still very, very early in the development journey. The intercepts we've seen so far tend to rely on exceptional pilot skill with very little mechanical assistance, as well as warheads and systems that could probably be much better optimised against aerial targets. If there's one particular platform type I might tentatively suggest needs to watch this area particularly closely, it's probably the helicopters. So far, one of the more commonly used approaches by helicopters in Ukraine to avoid things like the man-pads threat has been to stay out of range and line of sight wherever possible. That's meant things like pitch-up attacks using unguided rockets or very long-range ATGM strikes. If you start adding things like longer-range drones and loitering munitions to that threat picture, however, then that may be one more thing for your very expensive helicopters and difficult-to-replace pilots to have to deal with. And it will be very interesting to see if we get more evidence of these sorts of engagements in Ukraine in the coming months. To zoom out one last time though, whatever sort of air defence system you're talking about, Ukraine probably raises a final question about what exactly constitutes enough when it comes to magazine depth. Ukraine started in February 2022 with one of the largest stockpiles of anti-aircraft missiles and missile systems in the world, and yet by 2023 we were starting to get reporting that they were running dangerously low. Russia started the war with an even larger inventory and an opponent that had basically nothing in terms of long-range cruise missiles and a very limited supply of things like TBMs. And yet even that system at times has struggled to keep up with the scale and dispersion of threats the Ukrainians have been able to throw at it. That suggests there may be a difficult ongoing modelling challenge for various forces going forward. What are you actually going to try and defend? What are you willing to defend it against? And realistically, what sort of investment is necessary to make that happen? Because as the Russian experience has arguably shown, trying to defend everything all the time is an approach that has its limits. And it may sometimes or regularly be the case that building up additional offensive capabilities instead that enable you to inhibit the ability of an opponent to launch strikes in the first place, rather than intercepting them once they've already been launched, represents a potentially very efficient complementary approach. After all, as Ukraine has now shown on a couple of occasions, it may sometimes be easier to destroy an entire storage facility worth of ordnance, rather than knocking those missiles and bombs down individually once they're on their way to their targets. So from a defence economics perspective, there's probably an argument for any discussion around missile and air defence to also include a discussion of the offence and the potential value of range, precision, and offensive counter-air capabilities. In conclusion, the war in Ukraine is still mostly one of mutual air denial, forcing a reversion to standoff attacks, low-level flying, and the usage of long-range systems like one-way attack drones, cruise missiles, and TBMs. In terms of air and missile defences, Ukraine faces much greater resource limitations than Russia does, but has demonstrated various methods of trying to adapt to those resource limitations, but, at the risk of oversimplifying, have often tried to offset those resource limitations through the wide-scale and creative use of cheaper, more accessible systems, as well as a focus on counter-air operations as a partial response to Russian glide bombing. Russia, meanwhile, claims to be more extensively leaning on its traditional air defence systems. That implies a potential greater degree of protection for Russian forces against things like Ukrainian rocket artillery projectiles, but at the potential cost of a consequently greater consumption rate for Russian air defence interceptors. Going forward, the impact of unmanned systems on the air and missile defence challenge is probably going to be a continued area of focus. Drones have become a target for air defence systems, a threat to air defence systems, both directly and indirectly, and recently, an air defence system in and of themselves. There'll be more to talk about on that point when we look at Ukraine's cross-border operations next week and some of the recent engagements associated with it. But for now, I'm happy to leave that as a case of watch this space. It's highly unlikely that every future conflict is going to look like the one in Ukraine. Different potential conflicts will be framed by the context around them, geography, politics, and the forces involved. But that doesn't mean some of the lessons and technologies we're seeing used in Ukraine won't have potential impacts beyond it. And that may be just as true when it comes to matters of air and missile defence as it has been on the ground. And alright, channel update to close out. Right up front, I want to say I understand some of you are probably hoping for a video covering some of the more recent developments in Ukraine this week. We've gotten used to not seeing rapid developments in the front line, so I can understand why the interest is there. What I'll say though is that while with this war uncertainty is an unavoidable reality and I will inevitably get things wrong from time to time, my general preference is to prioritise being accurate over being quick. And so I've just wanted to provide a little more time for the situation to clarify so I can provide better coverage next week or the week after. I very much hope you understand, and I thank you for your patience. 2 other quick updates. Firstly, thank you to those patrons who have voted in the charity poll. I very much appreciate it. I'll likely be closing that one and finalising the results at the end of the coming week. Finally, for fans of the Peruvian Gaming channel, updates there have been on a relatively regular cadence lately. And the most recent video in the X4 series even included a first for the gaming channel, a 20-minute PowerPoint presentation. So if you're interested or morbidly curious, feel free to check that one out. As always, a broad thank you to all of you for the continued engagement with and support of the channel, and I hope to see you all again next week.